And that makes me it makes me think. So considering this idea of hypo and hyper sensitivity, I don't know how this would ever be proven, but it may be interesting for conversation. I know that Arthur Furstenberg, in his book, talked about the fact that in 1889, which is when we began stringing these very long antennas across the face of the earth, we call them power lines, and broadcasting music that had never been heard before, this 60 cycle or 50 cycle electric and magnetic fields,
Yep.
that there was an influenza pandemic, and it lasted for 4 years, and at least a million people perished from this. And people may say, well, what does that have to do anything? That's the flu, that's influenza. But then also discussed in the book is the meaning of influenza, is influence of the stars. And it's been known for some time that prior to stretching those long antennas across the face of the earth, we call power lines, and broadcasting these synthetic frequencies, really influenza came and went according to the solar maximum, which would then create a difference in the natural magnetic fields that we would experience. So, am I saying what I'm saying is correct so far? And then I'd like to continue and ask a question.
Well, it is correct, definitely, and it's a very interesting power line of discussion, I would call it. So yes.
So let's imagine for just a moment that those people who died were among the group of people that were more sensitive than others. And so
yes,
I note
yeah,
that,
or the opposite.
ah,
They could have been the normal, healthy people, and not the hypersensitive persons that maybe had an immune system, the latter one, that were more capable of dealing with both viral and bacterial attacks. And also, they were sort of more accustomed to that kind of exposure situations. And also, finally, maybe they had at the time avoidance reactions, which we today might say, oh, we need to study it because we don't really know what happened at the time. But a parallel line of proof is that when I talk to beekeepers, they always tell me you cannot have beehives under power lines because that will deteriorate the production volume and quality of honey and honeycombs and so on. And, when people tell me things like that, I go, what? Does our prime minister know this? And the electricity companies? And they don't, of course, but every beekeeper, they know it. So they keep their hives away from the power lines.
yes. And in the Isle of Wight, we had the first colony collapse disorder among the honeybees when RF, or radio frequency radiation, began coming from that area from transmitters.
Yeah.
And they long ago, people argue that it's the variola mite, for example. Well, way back when this first happened, they investigated the variola mite, and certainly those aren't helpful to the bee's physiology, but it's sort of a known thing, and a bee can live with those, not as well, can live with them. And so they determined at that time, I guess this would have been 100 years ago, maybe over 100 years ago, that, and it can't be proven, okay? It's a correlation, but it's interesting. So where I was headed with this idea of hypo and hyper was then also what we have seen is, in Dr. Samuel Milham's book, where he took an epidemiological view of the rollout of the power lines and the disease of modern civilization. And then Arthur Furstenberg was careful to document what happened with shortwave radio when that began using in common use around the time of what was then called the Spanish flu, and then
Yeah.
excess deaths when the first satellites went up, and so on. And then I was going to ask the question, well, we can't really know. You've pointed out that it may be an inferior immune system, or it might be a superior immune system. But if it were that the sensitive ones were the ones that were dying off,
Yeah.
then it would argue very strongly that we won't have any in the future because of the unlimited growth of these
Yeah,
fields.
I agree. Or the opposite, because when I give lectures, I often point to that maybe the future will hold survivors, which we today would call then hypersensitive, because they will avoid the exposure situations. They will not buy any Wi-Fi routers or cell phones and so on, and they will keep away from any antenna installations, etc., as will very, very poor people around the world who cannot afford to buy a cell phone or even buy the infrastructure to build a cell phone system. And we will pity them today, but maybe in a 50 or 100 years' time, they will be standing as the last man standing in the Western, with smoking gun barrels. But maybe they will be the ones that actually survive, because the rest of us, we will have the irradiation wherever we are, wherever we go to school or work or so on, and we will not see the train coming. And for instance, myself, I don't have any reactions to any form of non-ionizing radiation. Uh, so therefore, I'm, of course, being irradiated wherever I am.
Right. So in 100 years, we'll get together again, and we'll
Yeah, of course, you have to call me then.
we'll know the
But
answer.
let's stick to this for a second, because there are a few papers pointing to, just as a working hypothesis, that maybe the build out of 5G systems and the occurrence, first in Wuhan in China and later on all over the world, of COVID-19 might have something to do with each other. And don't forget also, and that's very well documented, that bacteria that are irradiated either by cell phone radiation or Wi-Fi router radiation, they will become antibiotic resistant. And when the World Health Organization was asked during the pandemic if COVID-19 is the worst threat to mankind, then the official representative of the World Health Organization in Geneva, in Switzerland, he said that no, we can cope with that, But the reporter was very persistent and said, well, what is then the worst threat health wise to mankind? And then the guy said, well, that's easy to answer. That's antibiotic resistance in healthcare. If you call me 100 years' time, maybe there will be no one picking up, because it was pointed out in 2017, it was, that by the year 2050, then in the order of 10 million people around the world will die prematurely because of antibiotic resistance. But the problem is that they didn't take into account the exposure effect on bacteria. So if you point these two facts together, both the radiation effect and the antibiotic resistance, maybe the 10 million by the time will be 8.2 billion people. It
Yeah.
could be the end of everything, except then people that might be living far away. I heard some years ago, for instance, that people in Patagonia, in the very southern tip of South America, they live very primitively and very isolatedly, and maybe they will be able to sustain human life and restart the whole project of mankind, and maybe some other groups as well.